Thank you for tuning in today. My name is Linda J. Hansen, your host of the Prosperity 101 podcast, where we seek to unleash the power of employers to reclaim and preserve America by connecting boardroom to breakroom and policy to paycheck. Employers educating employees about public policy issues that affect their jobs can lead to greater employee loyalty, engagement, and retention, and to an increased awareness of the blessings and responsibilities of living in a free society. We help people understand the foundations of true prosperity, the policies of prosperity, and how to protect prosperity by becoming informed, involved, and impactful. To access our podcast library and resources, or to sign our Employers Unleashed pledge, visit prosperity101.com. Thank you so much for tuning in today. It is always a pleasure to have you join us. And today, like so many days, I have a wonderful guest. But before I introduce the guest, I want to just invite you to go to our website, prosperity101.com, where you can see our new Employers Unleashed pledge. We have a 3-point pledge on there where you express your support for the Judeo-Christian values that made America great. You express your support for promoting those values, and you say that you will share one thing in your workplace to help other people understand how important it is to support the values that made America great. So we want to protect freedom and true prosperity, which is human flourishing and freedom. So thank you for tuning in to the Prosperity 101 podcast. And today I would like to welcome our guest. Marc Morano is an award-winning author. He manages the climatedepot.com news and information service, but also the most recent book that I think you want to read, make sure you get this, is called The Great Reset, Global Elites and the Permanent Lockdown. When I want to talk about what's happening in the global elite world and climate and all their climate hysteria, I always look to Marc Morano because he's become a trusted voice to me, and I know he will be to you as well. So Marc, thank you for joining with the podcast again.
Thank you, Linda. Happy to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, it's always, I love listening and reading your work because you bring insights that aren't always in the mainstream media, obviously. But I know that this is something you have studied for years and years and years. And I invited you back on the podcast because there was so much news surrounding the World Economic Forum event in Davos recently, and how much the climate agenda has shifted with the global elites and the whole you'll eat bugs and own nothing and be happy agenda. And I know that you were there and you had some great insights. So first, before you go into that, if you just want to share with the listeners who maybe have never heard of you or know anything about you other than my brief and incomplete introduction, maybe just share a little bit about how you got to where you are, why you do it, and then we can go into what happened at Davos.
Well, I've been a journalist for 35 years or so, and I started actually with Rush Limbaugh, the television show. I was his correspondent in Washington, our man in Washington, as Rush used to call it. And I covered the whole DC political scene, which was very humorous and had a lot of fun doing it. Wore a hat, trench coat, went undercover, got thrown out, had my camera seized at the Clinton White House. And then I worked for a show called American Investigator, which was like a 60 minutes news style show, and did a lot of environmental reporting, investigating the wetlands and or even organic food practices, and also endangered species, and a whole series of other videos. And then I worked for Cybercast News Service, and then I went to work for the U.S. Senate. And it was the U.S. Senate that I started really focusing in on global warming. And that was back 20 years ago. And started global warming about 25 years ago, and I started interviewing scientists. But I started going to the UN conferences. I've been to 24 out of the last 22 out of the last 24 UN climate summits around the world, from everywhere from Bali, Indonesia, to Kenya, to South Africa, to Azerbaijan, to Argentina, to Brazil, to Egypt, and throughout the Middle East and all over Europe. And so I focus on that climate agenda, and and as part of that, the World Economic Forum merged the climate agenda with the public health agenda back in 2020, if you recall, and issued a call for the Great Reset, Build Back Better, which everyone was parroting. And so that sort of brings, I have a website called climatedepot.com, which is daily news and coverage on the climate, energy, environment, Great Reset, etc.
It's such a great career. And for those of us who are old enough to remember some of the things that you talk about, like you in a trench coat with Rush Limbaugh and things, it's great. So this is something that, you haven't come upon lightly. It's something you've been studying for a long time. You've seen the trends in every direction. You understand the players. And I think your insight into this year's World Economic Forum summit, I think is just so incredible because you've seen a real shift. First, could you tell us what, for people who maybe don't even know what we're talking about when we talk about the climate summits that they've had at these forums, can you explain a little bit about what their agenda was? I mean, we've all heard global warming, we've heard
Yeah.
climate change and things, but explain a little bit on that. But then, what was the big shift this year? And I know we need to discuss too, like the Trump administration 1.0 versus Trump
Yeah.
administration 2.0. So I think those are just, let's help guide the listener to that point.
All right, well, without even getting into the science, the idea that mankind is driving a catastrophe, let's set that aside. In 1988, the United Nations formed their climate panel, and this was the claim. And they were essentially were a scientific panel handpicked by governments around the world with a vested interest in the solutions to this alleged crisis. So in 1988, the UN decided to have a climate panel that had to toe the line that carbon dioxide was creating a climate catastrophe. And guess what? As a bonus, the UN got to also be in charge of the solution, which meant annual United Nations climate summits all around the world. So what happened was the UN became a self-serving lobbying organization on climate. In other words, if they found climate wasn't going to cause a catastrophe, they'd fail to have a reason to have their climate panel and their meetings and their funding. And then they would also fail to have these annual summits and the solution, and they'd be in charge of global taxes and everything else. We just saw the Trump administration kill the global shipping tax earlier in 2025 in the fall. So that's the con of the UN. It's just a lobbying organization that pretends to be this distinguished scientific body. It's called the Internet Scientific Panel, it's called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Anyway, long story short, George H.W. Bush gets us into this whole mess of the UN climate summits. He signs a 1992 treaty, which then gets the U.S. involved, leads to Copenhagen agreements, leads to Kyoto Protocol, leads ultimately to the Paris Agreement, and the U.S. is now tied up in doing all this UN crap with sustainable development and net zero and Green New Deal and all these restrictions and banning cars and limiting meat eating and all that. So, fast forwarding all of that, you have the World Economic Forum when COVID hit in 2020. Klaus Schwab, the then chairman, announced with glee that this was a great opportunity. He had many climate activists just openly say the quiet part out loud. If the world can shut down for a virus, we can do the same thing for climate. And we have person after person after person. John Kerry, the climate envoy, former climate envoy under Obama, was literally saying, these are the same, one and the same things and the same solution. And they love the fact that the Western world took a page from one party rule China and literally decided no votes of anyone in office. We were going to have unelected bureaucrats dictate every aspect of our life. And that's not an exaggeration. Weddings canceled, funerals canceled, medical procedures canceled, school canceled, jobs canceled, stay-at-home orders issued, vaccine mandates, mask mandates, travel restrictions, unbelievable. And this filled the World Economic Forum, which had been founded in the 1970s of the global elite of the world, the ruling class, essentially. It filled them with such hope and optimism because the world, unfortunately, we went along. I mean, and this was, I think, had Hillary Clinton been president in 2020, I think there would have been a greater rebellion. But sadly, it's one of Donald Trump's big mistakes of one of his first term was going along with Deborah Birx and Anthony Fauci and allowing any kind of remember the 2 weeks to slow the flesh, stop
Right.
the spread. It was a con, and we know this because the health officials wrote about it. Deborah Birx actually wrote about how they were going to trick Trump into going along with it, and they were very proud of themselves for that. So anyway, so that's when they announced the World Economic Forum, the Great Reset. And this was the Great Reset. You'll own nothing and be happy. Meat will be a rare treat. Everything you want will be delivered at your house. You'll have no privacy. We'll become useless eaters as AI takes over and automation. And we're going to need psychotropic drugs and video games to dull the masses who are going to have no jobs and essentially be forced to stay at home. They love this. There were so many people praising, oh, look at that, emissions are down, oh, the recession's hitting everyone, economic growth, this is exactly what they had called for. So that's what happened. And so we went through years of this with the World Economic Forum, every world leader from Biden to UK prime ministers to Justin Trudeau, all saying, build back better, the Great Reset is here, Al Gore, John Kerry. And one man, the movement, I should say, Donald Trump, because he did something no other Republican had done, and he started doing it back in 2015, he reframed the climate debate. In other words, you could have George H.W. Bush, who signed the Rio Earth Summit Treaty. They always wanted to appear green. They never wanted to offend. They wanted to be, oh, me too, me too. But we don't want to go as fast as Al Gore, but we all agree with him. We all want a clean Earth. Donald Trump came in and said environmentalism is one thing, but climate is a con, it's a scam, it's a religion, it's a cult. And he started that in 2000, his first term, but all of his appointees were very careful and never really challenged the status quo. Well, I think because he lost the election, and I will say, aside from voter fraud, Donald Trump really toppled his whole first term by going along with that 2 weeks to stop the spread. Anyway, long story short, Donald Trump doesn't get reelected for whatever reason. And he then, all the prosecutions, he gets huge populist surge of supporters. And he comes in 2.0 like gangbusters. And this is important to what happened in Davos, is why I'm setting this up. He came in with 250 actions thus far in 1 year, dismantling the climate, energy, net zero, Green New Deal, Inflation Reduction Act, UN. The entire agenda has been just dismantled. But he's done the most important thing is he's reframed the narrative.
Yes.
And because he's reframed the narrative, words are powerful. Language is powerful. It's not just Donald Trump. It's his energy secretary, Chris Wright. It's his EPA director, Lee Zeldin. Lee Zeldin uses words like scam, cult, religion routinely as the EPA, environmental protection, when he describes climate change. That has been so important that now even the CNN pollster is saying, because of the shift in narrative, there are less people. We're at the same levels of people concerned in the US about climate change as we were in the 1980s, the late 1980s, when they first started asking these questions. And that goes to show you how important narrative is. And that's what Trump 1.0 didn't really do. I mean, sure, Trump was at a rally or in 60 Minutes, he might make a couple comments, but this was a sustained narrative change that telling the world that you've been conned, this is a hoax, this is a scam. And it's what climate skeptics like myself have been saying. I wrote the Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change. I also wrote Green Fraud, Why the Green New Deal is Worse Than You Think. And it's what we've been screaming all along. And particularly me, I was a former communication director in the US Senate. I was a speechwriter for Senator James Inhofe. This is where you change hearts and minds. You got to reframe the debate. This is why people like Rush Limbaugh were so powerful. This is why great orators are so powerful, because they move public opinion. And that's what's happened. But Donald Trump did something even more significant. He had, first of all, he had luck on his side because there was a huge shift post-COVID. And also deep enough into this, remember the climate scare legislatively, it started in the late 80s in terms of a scare, then they started infrastructure. But you had Arnold Schwarzenegger even in 2005. We're going to do the climate bill in California. He was praised as an environmental hero. Meanwhile, California, none of the policies he was advocating were even implemented yet. Fast forward 2015, 2020. By 2024, the world had seen, I'm talking Europe, I'm talking Canada, Australia, the Western world particularly, had seen what a fraud, the lies of solar and wind, all the subsidies, still less than 5% of our energy, less than 15% of the electricity, despite all the mandate subsidies, trying to ban the competition, EV promises, 1,000 pounds of materials dug up in China to make 500,000 pounds of material dug up in China to make 1,000 pound Tesla battery. But these are the green cars. Oh, and we'll ship them across sea and we'll recharge them on a fossil fuel grid. And then, of course, don't let's not talk about the recycling of it. But these are the green cars.
Right.
Full bleep from beginning to end. Anyway, Donald Trump comes in and he's presiding over the collapse of the climate agenda globally. Europe doesn't want any part of it. Some like 80 countries didn't even submit their climate targets by the time the COP30 UN climate summit began in Brazil, which I attended. All of that happened. Donald Trump comes in, does 250 actions. The U.S. Congress is now following up, which is surprising, but it's good. They legislatively killed this gas-powered car ban for the future. They've followed up on not deflating, but defunding the solar and wind mandates of the Inflation Reduction Act. And they've done an amazing job with all that. So all of this is happening globally. You have the farmers in Europe revolting, throwing manure on the gates of the entrance of the EU building in Brussels, which I've been to, and no more building better in the world that deserves manure thrown on it than the EU headquarters. And you had farmers across Europe. They had big elections there in 2024 where they reversed a lot of the Green New Deal candidates. You had skepticism growing in Germany and France and the UK. I met Nigel Farage when I was in Davos. Anyway, long story short, I haven't even gotten to Davos yet. But the point of this being, Donald Trump presided over it. He gave an incredible speech in September, basically saying, all you world leaders, Western leaders in particular, you've been conned, scammed. The UN is a hoax. And it was just unbelievable. And there's been no pushback in the US. You're not hearing from AOC. You're not hearing from Nancy Pelosi. The only person who really seems to care, and I give him credit for caring, is Al Gore. Now, it could just be because he's a grift and wanted the money, but I think he's a true believer. But he's the only person still holding the narrative. And when I say that, Jeff Bezos, major climate funder, he's now writing Washington Post editorial board to the extent there's still a paper. He's laid off most of the climate reporters.
Right.
And now writing Washington Post editorial boards, not some op-ed writer, writing editorial boards dismantling the entire Green New Deal, going after the net zero, going after the EV mandates, attacking Biden's policies. Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, the number one funder, wanted to funding Harvard University to block the sun so we could cool the earth, geoengineer the climate. Bill Gates at every UN climate summit, Bill Gates funding all of these media outlets. He's now saying climate's not a catastrophe. We need human flourishing instead. He's now funding Bjorn Lomborg, the global warming skeptic in England. Al Gore is now attacking Bill Gates at a UN climate summit. So that's the backdrop. Then we have Davos this year in January. This is the annual meeting. And what they have at these meetings, and they've been doing it for decades, since 1972, I believe was the original year they started the organization. This is the ruling class. This is the best and brightest. This is the Ivy League. This is the corporate CEOs. These are the millionaires and the billionaires. These are the mid-level bureaucrats. These are the higher level bureaucrats. These are the prime ministers and presidents and in royal families. And these are the Hollywood celebrities, the oligarchs. They all meet every year, and they've been doing this for decades. And they plot how they're going to do central bank, digital currency. And the way to look at this, just so you understand the true perspective of Davos, is for thousands of years of human civilization, the ruling class has always tried to come up with reasons why the rest of us can't be free. It's usually involving a crisis, war, terrorism, climate, a virus, whatever it is. They're going to have to bypass usual democracy, declare an emergency. And this is when, throughout human history, going back to the Roman Empire, through the Middle Ages, through 1930s Germany, the greatest violations of human rights have occurred during these times of crises that our ruling class has declared. And so that's what the World Economic Forum's purpose was, always come up with reasons why we can't be free. And they were really good at it, really, really good at it. I got to give them credit for that. And it was sad because many so-called conservatives would go and they would go along with it and they would go, it's very sad, the uniparty situation we have in Washington. But anyway, what we had this year, everything changed. They did a survey ahead of time, first of all, and climate change had dropped near the bottom of even those attending the World Economic Forum. Climate dropped off the list in terms of speakers, everything else. The only speaker that I'm aware of any high profile, they had little panels, which I'll mention in a second, but was Al Gore. Al Gore was there talking about climate migrant, millions of climate immigrants, and all, nonsense. He could have said the same speech in 2010, 2015, 2020. Nothing's changed for Al Gore. But what has changed is he got no media coverage. No one cared. International media, until Gore's highest media point. I'm not making this up. Al Gore was reduced to heckling speakers at the World Economic Forum. In this case, it was Trump's Commerce Secretary. He was booing him and audibly, verbally heckling him from the audience. He wasn't like on a panel with him. This was just Al Gore at the event. That's how frustrating it was. The man who coined the term or started the whole Great Reset is long gone. The World Economic Forum booted out Klaus Schwab. Why? Because they ostensibly claimed, oh, he had big expense bills at hotels. I'm sorry, what? They got rid of him because he was the vilification of the evil Bond villain, and they knew they had to have a new page. So as such, they bring in Larry Fink, the BlackRock CEO, as the co-chair. Larry Fink now openly admits at these meetings, solar and wind can't power AI. Solar and wind, we need fossil fuels. Larry Fink is now saying we did some overreach. He started trying to walk back the whole Great Reset agenda. And Donald Trump, through a master class of diplomacy, not completely hijacked the meeting. The whole thing became about, is Donald Trump going to annex Greenland, or what's he going to do? World leaders were talking about an intervention at one point with Macron leading it. And they were going to sit Donald Trump down and bring his first grade teacher in or something to take him into rehab or something, but none of that happened. Donald Trump came, took over the meeting. Not only he did, but he had Howard Lutnick and he had Scott Bessent as Treasury Secretary give unbelievable speeches, just trashing Europe for going along with net zero. His Commerce Secretary, in particularly, told the European leaders there, why would you ever go along with net zero when your industrial base is collapsed? You don't even make your own battery, and you're going to make China wealthier. Just going on and on. It was unbelievable. I mean, you can't take these words back. Meaning, I know people say, "Oh, it's bureaucrat, it's rhetoric, it doesn't mean anything." It means a ton because people hear it, they absorb it. That's why narrative control is so important. You can't think of COVID. They couldn't impose all of the things I just mentioned without a vote unless people were scared scared as hell of it. That's why the narrative was, you're going to die. You're a grandma killer if you don't wear a mask, etc. That is how you move. I mean, that and military force is how you move. But even military force, at some level, you've got to have, a narrative or a propaganda level. You kill one person to scare the 80 million people who you see the one person die. There's a thing, there's a whole technique with this, with leaders. But anyway, so that's what happened in Davos. It was the first time I got to go in person. I also attended the Climate Hub, which was fascinating because they decided to go stealth on climate. They're still there, but they're going this financialization in nature. They had a whole seminar, and I attended that and sat in and listened. And they're basically talking about every tree, lake, forest, body of water, pond, creek is going to be assigned a sort of ESG score, environment, social governance, or a banking score. And international banks are going to basically have the right, and this is in conjunction with these environmental groups suing on behalf of like a forest or a river because the river's rights are being violated by development or putting in a dam. And so this is where they want to go, a boring bureaucratic financialization sort of the climate scare below the radar. And that's the key thing there. And they're also still talking about the merging of climate into public health. And we're dealing with that. We have doctors have medical toolkits, climate toolkits. We have calls to put climate on the death certificate as a cause of death. Doctors in Canada are already diagnosing patients with suffering from climate change if you have heat stroke. So they also want to have these heat wave death tolls, very similar to COVID, and this was happening under Biden. That's a good question. I'm not sure if Trump has actually gotten rid of that. But the idea would be once you have death tolls, and they're named Winter Storm Fern, which I'm here in Virginia, which I'm not comfortable with that, because then you get, oh, well, Fern had this kind of death toll, and they're going to treat them like hurricanes, a snowstorm. And I can understand scientifically that, but I'm also aware of how they manipulate that scientifically. So a future Gavin Newsom administration could literally turn this into, look at this. We had this many people die in that winter storm, this many people die in that heat wave. Look at the climate death toll, and there's gonna be like a COVID death toll in the corner of your screen. So this is all, there's a lot that could come back. But what makes it so hard is that Donald Trump changed the narrative. The World Economic Forum is in full retreat. The UN is just in full failure mode. I mean, they're not retreating, but they're in full failure. The head of the UN, Secretary General, just says the same old crap that no one pays. I mean, absurd stuff. Like, this is the climate emergency we're in it. He's a former head of Socialist International, so he's just peddling his wares. Like no one's paying attention. But you always have to pay attention to what they can do behind the scenes. And that's why things like the financialization of nature, all these UN, there's a sale of shipping tax they were just trying to pass. Donald Trump, they were able to stop. There's now some other tax coming up that they're going to have to do to try to stop that as well. And these are things that we've signed under Democrat presidents in particular that we're sort of obligated to, that we would actually have to pay. And it's, again, the UN has a climate slush fund. They transfer this money to the leaders in Africa and the developing world, South America, who are best able to keep their citizens locked in poverty. In other words, if you have poor economic growth and very low development, the UN is going to give you a lot of money, pat you on the back and say, you're doing it right. And then you get all that money, you can enrich your friends, campaign contributions, you can build stadiums, monuments to yourself, whatever you want to do. That's who the UN rewards, because they see economic growth, prosperity, human flourishing as the enemy of the climate. So sorry about that. That was a long... a question.
That's okay. It's great. You got it all in. It's like we didn't have to waste time with me asking you the next question. Yeah, no, it's really good. And the thing about it, I think that people don't understand. We've really gotten used to hearing like the United Nations or the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization. All these things sound so great. They sound so great. But if you look under the hood, there's a lot of problems in terms of our freedoms and our ability to flourish. And in fact, the ability to really take care of the environment the way that we know to do. I mean, just think of, this is a whole nother episode we could discuss, but, farming practices and things like that, taking care of the soil, all these things that they try to have us do. And like you mentioned, the farmers that rioted in Europe and, or protested, they didn't really riot, but they protested. And, we can see that there's a lot of common sense lacking. But now that there's all these big data centers that are being built and there's this new energy drain, all of a sudden, all of a sudden, they seem to be waking up. I mean, for years and years and years, I have worked with a nonprofit that promoted the use of small modular reactors, nuclear reactors, especially molten salt reactors. And, what we can do when we have reliable, clean energy, such as nuclear, and in these new reactors that are safe and affordable and things for years, working on that, working on different energy sources like thorium, working on this. And now all of a sudden, it's like, oh, they need more power for what they want to do with AI and everything. And now, oh, climate, it's not that big a deal. I would say just follow the money on their opinions. But, and I just, for those in the audience that are younger, I think we should just touch on the fact that when we were growing up, I'm not sure your age, but when we were growing up, maybe you remember the world was going to be too cold. Yeah. We were all going to freeze to death. That was the big scare, is we were all going to freeze to death. And then all of a sudden it turned to, oh no, it's going to be too hot, and it was global freezing, global warming. And now they just call it climate because they can't decide, and all the data doesn't
covers everything. The heat wave, right. But this recent New York Times is saying the record cold we've had in the US is climate change.
Yeah, of course, and they just need to live longer and realize that, lots of years are cold and some years are hot, and it just all balances out. So, and I just think it's very important too that we look at the fact that, Trump has brought in a lot of good executive orders and has pulled us out, like you mentioned, some of these treaties that have been so harmful, or these agreements that have been so harmful. But we really need to put pressure on Congress to say we need those things codified into law, so that if a new president comes in, we still aren't going to go backwards into this globalist agenda where, we can't have the light bulbs we want, or we can't can't have a dishwasher that washes dishes, or, a shower that has enough water to get clean, all these things that have been problematic in terms of regulatory restrictions. And so, along with that, that's where I say to employers, it's important to help employees understand how much all of this affects their job, affects the manufacturing, affects, the ability to grow businesses, the ability to grow communities, the ability to pay paychecks. So, what would you say to employers who need to educate employees about these issues?
Well, I would tell them to look at look at the proposed solutions. You don't get in a scientific debate, but you look at it even like the restrictions on movement. You have
Mhm.
if, like, for instance, in Europe, parts of Europe are banning flights 2.5 hours or less. So that people can't fly. There's no restrictions on private jets. Look at the people who are promoting the idea of climate restrictions. Are they following it? Where the Bill Gates and Al Gores of the world, these were people living in private jets in multiple mansions, traveling around the world, doing what John Kerry said, flying to win an environmental award at a private jet, saying, "Do you know who I am? I'm the most important person." So when the people promoting the solution aren't willing to follow any of the actual solutions, then there's something rotten there. And also, they just need to basically know that, throughout history, people have used these scares to try to get us to move in certain directions. And all you have to do is ask simple questions like, well, assuming we did all the solutions that have been proposed, what would happen? And analysis has shown that even if the UN got everything they wanted, even if you believed their climate claims, you would have no change in temperature 100 years from now, perceptible change in temperature 100 years from now, assuming the UN was right in the science and assuming all the nations followed it. So it was just a big con from the beginning. And the idea would be, if we did face a climate emergency and we had to rely on all the Green New Deal and the United Nations to save us, we'd all be doomed. So it's not about the climate. It's about controlling controlling the economy and controlling your freedom of movement, your diet. I mean, the net zero was very simple. It was a collapse of modern agriculture through all these restrictions, particularly methane. Which was going to restrict our food supply, force us into eating bugs and lab grown meat. And then secondly, it was going to restrict our freedom of movement, flight bans, CNN, carbon passports, taxes, making flights more expensive. And then, of course, cars are going to be restricted, a la Cuba. The idea would be only electric cars, which mean only the elite. Only, by the way, the wealthiest can buy the electric cars. Most of the 7% of all electric cars, not most, but a lot of it was wealthy people buying a second car that was electric, not, a primary car. So that, and of course, the collapse of just the economy in general, planned recessions to fight global warming. They wanted everyone poorer so the government could then be more in charge, and you'd be more reliant and thus more compliant with whatever they want, which is why they loved COVID again, because it collapsed the economy, it collapsed the whole social structure. You couldn't even really communicate except online. And then, of course, they started what they do online immediately, started mass increase in censorship online. You couldn't even question a mask effectiveness, even though the CDC was on record for decades saying masks don't work, even though the Washington. So yeah, just one small example.
Right. That's great. Well, and for my audience too, I just want to invite you with the whole concept of employers educating employees about the public policy issues that affect their jobs. In addition to having this 3-point pledge that I mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, I also have a webinar series on reclaiming the mountains of culture, and the 7 mountains of culture, like business, family, media, arts and entertainment, government and military, education, and religion, and reclaiming those mountains of culture with, common sense and the values and principles that made our nation great, the Judeo-Christian principles that made our nation great. And of course, we'll be covering the media mountain, which I love what you said at the beginning of our interview. You talked about how important it is for us to have a narrative that helps to educate people. And you've just gone through so many times where these climate change leaders have had a narrative. It didn't matter if it was true or not, but they had a narrative that convinced people. So how much better for those of us who can say, we actually have truth and we want you to be free. And let's take back that mountain of media and control the narrative when it comes to this issue too. So business owners, you can do that, and please join me, reach out to me, and you can be part of that webinar where we can talk about what you can do in your business to help reclaim that mountain and control the narrative. So do you have any other closing comments before we close and let people know how to contact you?
No, I was just going to say this really is the low point for the climate change movement. However, it's been decades of billionaire funding and corporate funding and media and academia. And so don't expect it to go away. Expect it to go stealth, expect it to lie low, and expect it to be resurrected one day. So that's
Yes, it'll be resurrected under a new name.
yeah. Or
Right. Yes.
yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and please give people your contact information, how to follow you and learn more about what you do. And I just, thank you so much. So
Thank you.
please
Okay, it's climatedepot.com. I'm on X or Twitter at Climate Depot, DEPOT. I also, my book, Great Reset, Global Elites and the Permanent Lockdown. And also I did two movies, Climate Hustle 1, Climate Hustle 2. Climate Hustle 2 was the most recent and featured Kevin Sorbo narrating. And that's available at climatehustle.com, by the way. So that's a fun movie to watch. It goes through the religious aspects of climate and also the children's indoctrination and the whole agenda.
the whole thing. It's very worthwhile. So thank you so much for doing all of
Thank you,
that
Lynn.
and for your lifetime of really helping to get truth out. So thank you. Look forward to having you back again.
All right. Thank you, Linda. Appreciate
Okay,
it.
thank you.
All
Bye.
right, bye.
Thank you again for tuning in to this episode of the Prosperity 101 podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, and give us a great review. Don't forget to visit prosperity101.com to sign our Employers Unleashed pledge, to access our entire podcast library, or to discover resources for use in your workplace. Let us know how we can serve you. Contact us today at prosperity101.com.